This single decision would define the rest of Daniel's life. But at the time, it felt like nothing at all. It began on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic rain-soaked Tuesday, but the kind of ordinary Tuesday that disappears from memory almost as soon as it's over. The sky was an indifferent shade of gray, and the office air hummed with the familiar drone of computers and distant, muffled conversations. For Daniel, it was just another day in a long series of identical days. Daniel worked on the 7th floor of a building that was neither new nor old, just functional. The job involved paperwork, stacks of it. Forms, applications, and reports that moved from one desk to another in a slow, predictable current. Daniel's role was to review these documents, check a few boxes, and pass them along. It was a job built on routine, a world where the biggest event of the day was the coffee machine running out of milk. That afternoon, a file landed on Daniel's desk. It was a standard review, no different from the hundreds Daniel processed every month. The folder was manila, slightly worn at the edges. Inside, the papers were filled with dense blocks of text and numbers, a language only those in the department understood. Daniel's task was simple: verify the information against a set of established guidelines and give it a stamp of approval. Daniel scanned the first page, then the second. The details were mundane: names, dates, addresses, codes. The process was so familiar that Daniel could do it almost without thinking. The mind could drift to thoughts of dinner, or a show to watch later, or the weekend that felt impossibly far away. It was a state of professional autopilot, a skill honed over years of repetition. On page 3, there was a small discrepancy. A minor detail, a single data point that didn't quite align with the standard protocol. It was the kind of thing that happened from time to time. Usually, it meant flagging the document, sending it back to the originating department, and waiting a week for a corrected version to reappear. This was the proper procedure. It was the safe, documented, and correct path. Following this path meant more work, a delay in the workflow, and a file that would sit in a pending tray, a small monument to inefficiency. Daniel paused. The cursor blinked on the screen. The quiet hum of the office seemed to grow a little louder. To follow the procedure was to create a small, inconvenient ripple in an otherwise smooth day. The alternative was to let it go. It was a tiny inconsistency, almost certainly a typo. Correcting it internally or simply approving it as is would be faster. No one would likely ever notice. In the grand scheme of things, in the vast ocean of paperwork that flowed through this office, this one detail was a single drop of water. Insignificant. Daniel thought about the mountain of other files waiting, the deadline at the end of the week, the pressure to maintain a certain quota, an unspoken expectation of efficiency that hung in the air. Sending it back felt like a failure, like creating a problem where one didn't need to exist. The path of least resistance was tempting. It was the easy way, the quiet way. Daniel made a decision. A small click of the mouse. A stamp of approval. The file was moved from the In Progress folder to the Completed folder. It was done. The entire thought process from discovery to decision had taken less than a minute. Daniel picked up the next file and the moment was forgotten, swallowed by the routine of the afternoon. The discrepancy, the choice, the brief hesitation, it all dissolved back into the monotonous rhythm of the workday. It didn't seem important then. For months, life continued its steady, unremarkable pace. Seasons changed outside the office window, but inside, the climate remained the same. The same desks, the same computers, the same flow of paper. Daniel's decision on that ordinary Tuesday was buried under thousands of subsequent decisions, each one just as small, just as routine. There was no immediate consequence. No alarms went off. No one came asking questions. The system just kept running, and the file, with its tiny overlooked error, moved on to the next stage, and the next, disappearing deep into the bureaucratic machinery. But this detail would quietly return. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. About a year later, a new initiative was announced. A departmental audit. It was framed as a routine checkup, a way to modernize systems and improve efficiency. Consultants in sharp suits appeared, carrying laptops and speaking a language of metrics and optimization. They began to dig through the archives, examining processes from years past. They were looking for patterns, for anomalies, for the small cracks in the foundation that over time could weaken the entire structure. At first, it was just background noise. Another corporate project that felt disconnected from the daily work. But then the whispers started. Whispers of restructuring, of redundancy, of performance reviews that were no longer just a formality. The mood in the office began to shift. The quiet hum was now laced with a subtle tension. People spoke in lower voices. The comfortable autopilot was replaced by a new, sharp awareness. Every email, every meeting, every file suddenly felt heavier. One afternoon, Daniel was called into a small, windowless conference room. One of the consultants was there, along with a manager from Human Resources. They were polite, professional. On the table between them was a single manila folder. It looked familiar. The consultant opened it, pointing to page 3. To a single, highlighted line of text. The discrepancy. They didn't accuse. They just asked questions. Can you walk us through your thought process here? Do you recall this specific file? Why was the standard procedure not followed in this instance? Daniel couldn't recall the specific file. Not really. It was one of thousands. But seeing it there, under the stark fluorescent lights, the memory of that moment surfaced. The brief hesitation. The desire for an easier afternoon. The click of the mouse. A decision that had felt so small, so inconsequential, now sat before Daniel, magnified and illuminated. Daniel tried to explain. That it was minor. That it was likely a typo. That sending it back would have caused unnecessary delays. That it was a judgment call, made in the interest of efficiency. The explanation sounded weak, even to Daniel. In the new context of the audit, under the cold scrutiny of the consultants, efficiency sounded like negligence. A judgment call sounded like a failure to follow protocol. The meeting was short. There was no yelling, no drama. Just a calm, methodical disassembly of a single moment from a year ago. The consultant made notes. The HR manager nodded. They said they understood. They said they would be in touch. Daniel walked back to the desk. The office looked the same, but it felt entirely different. The familiar hum now sounded like a judgment. The faces of colleagues seemed to know. The weight of that one small decision, once so light it was forgettable, was now immense. It wasn't about the single error anymore. It had become a symbol. It was now part of a larger narrative being constructed by the auditors. A story of small lapses, of systemic weaknesses, of a culture that prioritized speed over accuracy. In the weeks that followed, the restructuring was announced. Daniel's position was among those being eliminated. The official reason was organizational streamlining, but everyone knew. The audit had provided the data, the justification. And Daniel's file, that one insignificant file from a forgotten Tuesday, had become a key piece of evidence. It was Exhibit A in the case for why change was necessary. The consequences weren't loud or dramatic, they were quiet and slow. Daniel's career path, once so clear and predictable, now veered into uncertainty. The stability that had defined Daniel's life was gone, replaced by a persistent, gnawing anxiety. Finding a new job was difficult. The reference from the old one was polite but coolly neutral. The story of the restructuring and the reasons behind it followed Daniel like a shadow. Years later, Daniel would often think back to that moment. Not with anger, but with a quiet, hollow sense of wonder. It was the hinge upon which a life had turned. A single, lazy click of a mouse. An act of minor convenience that had unraveled everything so slowly, so silently, that Daniel didn't even notice until it was far too late. It wasn't a malicious act, it wasn't a crime. It was just a small choice, made on an ordinary day by a person who just wanted to get through the afternoon. How many of our biggest moments are not the ones we celebrate or mourn, but the quiet, forgettable choices we make when we think no one is watching?